September 10th, 2011. A quiet street in Topeka, Kansas. The kind of neighborhood where nothing ever happens. At 5:01 in the evening, a 911 call comes through. The caller is a son. He tells the dispatcher he has just found his mother dead inside her own home. Her name is Sheila Hachmeister, 58 years old. A health information technician, a mother of two. Before she became a case file, Sheila Hachmeister was simply living her life. She was born in Texas, but grew up in Kansas, graduating high school in 1971. She went on to earn her bachelor's degree from Fort Hays State University. In 1974, she married Bill Hachmeister. The marriage didn't last, but the life she built afterward did. For decades, she worked as a health information technician, building a steady career in healthcare administration. By 2011, Sheila had settled into a routine in Topeka. She maintained her home on S.W. Bell Avenue. She kept working, and she kept her family close, including her two sons, Aaron and Jason, the younger of whom lived with her in the basement of that same house. Those who knew Sheila would later describe her as the kind of person who showed up for the people in her life, someone who kept her family under her roof even when it would have been easier not to. That loyalty was about to be tested in a way no one could have anticipated. To the outside world, Sheila Hachmeister was not a victim waiting to happen. She was a mother, a co-worker, a woman with a career, a home, and a future still ahead of her. She had no way of knowing that the people closest to her and the choices she was about to make about her own household would decide how her story ended. Inside the house on S.W. Bell Avenue, the arrangement looked, at first, like an ordinary one. An adult son living in his mother's basement. A parent offering support during a hard stretch. Thousands of families live this way without incident. But the longer Jason Hachmeister stayed, the more that arrangement began to fray. Jason struggled to hold steady work. Money was tight, and it was getting tighter. Sheila, meanwhile, was approaching a decision of her own. According to testimony later presented at trial, Sheila had started talking about her son moving out. She wanted him to stand on his own. By some accounts, that conversation was no longer hypothetical. It was something she intended to have with him directly, and soon. For Jason, that conversation would have meant more than losing a place to live. It would have meant losing the only safety net he had left. By the late summer of 2011, the strain inside the house on S.W. Bell Avenue had not eased. If anything, it had deepened. Sheila Hachmeister was still pushing toward the same decision, pushing Jason toward independence, toward moving out, toward a life that no longer depended on her income, her home, or her patience. For Jason, that future looked nothing like a fresh start. It looked like the floor disappearing beneath him. Prosecutors would later argue that Jason came to see only one way out, a way to stop the eviction, settle the money problems, and gain access to everything his mother still controlled: her home, her savings, and a $125,000 insurance policy that named her sons as beneficiaries. To be clear, at this point, none of it was proof. A struggling adult child and a frustrated parent are not, by themselves, evidence of murder. Pressure builds in thousands of households every year without anyone dying. But investigators would come to believe that inside this particular house, on this particular street, that pressure had been building for months, quietly, with no outlet and no resolution in sight. Then came September 10th, 2011, the day that pressure stopped building, and something else began. The morning of September 10th, 2011, began like any other inside the house on S.W. Bell Avenue. Sheila Hachmeister called down to her son that morning. She had a headache, she told him. Ordinary words. Nothing about them suggested they would later be picked apart by detectives, prosecutors, and a jury. At 11:30 a.m., Jason left the house. According to his own account, he spent the next several hours running errands across Topeka: Starbucks, Dillard's, Lens Crafters, a Vision Center, Kohl's, Walmart, Barnes & Noble, a visit to his grandfather in assisted living, a stop at Hy-Vee, a stop for gas. A full afternoon, accounted for almost minute by minute. He came home around 4 p.m. At 5:01, he called 911. He told dispatchers he had found his mother dead. To responding officers, it read as exactly what it appeared to be: a son walking into the worst moment of his life. But the coroner would later place Sheila's death hours before that call, not minutes. And as detectives sat down with Jason, his account began to stand out for a different reason. It was too complete. He told them his movements that day were caught on store cameras. He mentioned specifically that he'd worn a bright orange shirt, impossible to miss on any security feed. He said he had saved every single receipt. A text message to his mother, sent that morning, matched his itinerary almost word for word. People in shock rarely remember details with that kind of precision. People building an alibi do. The biggest mystery in the case was no longer only who had killed Sheila Hachmeister. It was whether the man who reported finding her body already knew, before he ever dialed 911, exactly what he would find. When emergency crews arrived at the house on SW Bell Avenue, they found exactly what Jason had described on the phone. Sheila, inside her own home, dead. But one look at the scene told responders this was not a natural death, and it was not an accident. There were no signs that anyone had forced their way inside. Nothing in the house had been torn apart or ransacked the way a robbery scene usually looks. A few items were missing. Most of the home was untouched. To investigators, that detail mattered. Whoever had done this hadn't broken in. They hadn't come looking for valuables. They had been inside the house, and they had wanted something far more specific than money sitting in a drawer. Word spread through Topeka quickly. Relatives were notified. Neighbors who had lived beside Sheila for years struggled to reconcile the woman they knew with what had happened inside her own walls. For many who knew her, the idea that this was random violence didn't sit right. Random violence doesn't usually walk through an unlocked door without forcing anything. And for detectives standing in that house, the absence of a break-in was the first sign that this case was not going to end with a stranger. As the investigation widened, detectives moved through every layer of Sheila Hachmeister's life. Forensic evidence, witness statements, financial records, cell phone activity. Hour by hour, they rebuilt the day she died, and the days surrounding it. Then, while Jason sat in custody, something unexpected arrived. Letters, sent to police, to news outlets, and to a friend of Jason's. Each one claimed the same thing. Jason was innocent, and the real killer was someone else entirely. A man who said Sheila had rejected him at a bar and tracked her down afterward. One letter went further, claiming the writer worked at the county jail, and even included a copy of a staff work schedule as proof. It would have been compelling if jail surveillance hadn't already captured Jason himself, alone, pulling a discarded work schedule out of a trash can. The letters meant to clear his name ended up doing the opposite. To investigators, they looked like the work of someone trying to engineer his own alibi from the inside. Other details surfaced. A manager at a strip club came forward, telling detectives that Jason had spoken about wanting his mother dead, and later told her he'd gone through with it, describing having to deal with carpet soaked through with blood. Jason's brother, Aaron, recalled bruising and what looked like carpet burns across Jason's knuckles in the days after the murder. Jason said he'd simply fallen, and there was the carpet itself. Investigators believed parts of the scene had been altered after the killing, cleaned, covered, or changed in ways that suggested someone had tried to erase what had happened there. Piece by piece, the case stopped pointing outward, toward a stranger who'd slipped through an unlocked door. It started pointing inward, toward the one person who had been there the entire time. Once detectives laid every statement side by side, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Jason's precise, minute-by-minute account of September 10th, the stores, the receipts, the orange shirt he insisted would show up on every camera in town, no longer read as the memory of a grieving son. It read as a script, built in advance, for a day he already knew the ending to. And the letters didn't help him. They hurt him. What was meant to plant doubt about a mystery man from out of state instead handed prosecutors a clear example of someone actively trying to steer the investigation away from himself, using a stolen work schedule, a fabricated identity, and a story that fell apart the moment surveillance footage was pulled. Then came the detail that closed the case. DNA recovered from the rope used to strangle Sheila matched her son. By the time detectives finished assembling the financial motive, the inconsistent alibi, the staged letters, and the physical evidence, they believed they had what they needed. The investigation that began with a grieving son's 911 call was about to end with that same man in handcuffs. Jason Hachmeister was charged with first-degree premeditated murder in the death of his mother. At trial, prosecutors built their case from pieces that, on their own, might not have meant much, but together formed a clear picture. A financial motive tied to a $125,000 insurance policy, witness testimony, including a strip club manager who said Jason had confessed to her directly, anonymous letters traced back to his own actions, a timeline too precise to be believed, and DNA, recovered from the rope used to strangle Sheila, that matched her son. The defense pushed back, arguing the state's case was circumstantial and pointed to gaps in the investigation, including the lack of scrutiny given to a man Sheila had been in contact with online in the weeks before her death. The jury didn't agree. They convicted Jason Hachmeister of first-degree murder. The judge called the killing merciless and called for no leniency. Jason was sentenced to what's known in Kansas as a hard 50, a term requiring him to serve 50 years before he can even be considered for parole. For all practical purposes, a life sentence. Years later, he appealed, arguing the trial had been unfair. The Kansas Supreme Court reviewed his claims and upheld the conviction. The case that began with a 911 call from a grieving son ended with that same son behind bars for the rest of his natural life, for killing the woman who raised him. In the end, the case of Sheila Hachmeister isn't remembered for a mystery man, a stranger in the dark, or a crime that came out of nowhere. It's remembered because the threat had been living in the house the entire time. But Sheila was more than the way her life ended. She was a daughter who left Texas for Kansas, built a career helping run hospital records, raised 2 sons, and kept showing up for the people she loved, even when it cost her. Cases like this leave behind an uncomfortable truth. The danger people fear most rarely comes from a locked door being forced open. More often, it's already inside, sitting at the dinner table, sleeping in the basement, calling itself family. The court record will always show how Sheila Hachmeister died, but the people who knew her would rather you remember how she lived. This has been the case of Sheila Hachmeister,